Now, to our main news, and it's all about the Conservative Party, of course, because the civil war, as they're calling it, over the Rwanda scheme has reached another level because the so-called Tory Star Chamber, that's a whole group of sort of lawyers and things, have rejected the Prime Minister's plan.
Yet the panel, upon which many right-leaning MPs were waiting, has concluded that the legislation is not sufficiently watertight and could vote it down when it reaches the Commons.
Well, it follows the PM's broadside at Labour, telling them to stop playing games and back his plan if they're serious about ending the small boat crisis.
Well, earlier on we asked political commentator Andy Williams if the plan was already dead in the water.
I don't think it's a serious plan. They already admit that it breaks international law. The party, the Conservative Party, is totally and utterly riven by this and has been by this issue for a very, very long time. You're trying to bring together two wings of a party who disagree on almost everything.
I mean, they're never going to agree on this, are they?
No,
Ever?
they're not. They're not. And the only thing that's holding them together is the way our electoral system works. They would have split by now otherwise. It's a total mess. And I think this week is going to be very bruising for them.
Do we have to pay any attention to what these lawyers are now saying? Because the problem with it, you're sort of saying, well, they've advised the Tory party. They've advised part of the Tory party that are already saying it's not strong enough.
Yeah,
so it's tainted, isn't it?
I think so. They're not an independent group of lawyers in a true sense. There are people who had already made their mind up that this bill was not sufficiently strong for them, and sure enough, the answer has come back as you would have expected, and that just gives them, and people like Suella Braverman who are saying, well, maybe she's going to vote against the government. Looks like there will be a significant number of people who are going to vote against the government, and that could, you know, potentially provoke that leadership contest that you were talking about.
That's voting for Christmas, isn't it?
I think so. I mean, I personally think the government, the Conservatives, are going to lose the next election, whatever happens. So, you know, prime ministers, when they're in power, they don't want to let go of the reins, and clearly, Rishi Sunak at this stage is looking at, well, how can I stay in power for as long as possible? But another leadership election, I mean, it's not going to work. It's not credible. I don't think the public would have it, whoever the leader is, even if it was a Boris, Nigel Farage joint.
Well, on that issue, then, I mean, look, you've got your basic problems of how do you get Boris back into Parliament, and then winning the vote amongst MPs and all the rest of it to get in that position. But also the idea that Farage would actually do this, I mean, it seems a remarkable suggestion. Plus, of course, he's not in charge of reform. He's honorary president. Richard Tice is the man holding the reins.
Ah, exactly. No, Richard Tice is in this dream ticket as well.
Oh, OK.
He's going to go into the Lords or something and have some sort of big ministerial job. I
mean, it's an interesting story, but it's a total fantasy. It's total fantasy. I think the other point here is that, you know, absolutely reform could be a problem for the Tories in terms of taking right-wing voters off them. But the real problem is in the centre, where nobody wants to vote Conservative at the next election. You know, the polls show Labour are 23 points ahead. It's a massive, massive lead. Now, polls have been wrong before, but that would be a huge margin of error.
How do we then balance this out? Because you look at a lot of polls and they say immigration is their biggest people's biggest concern. But yeah, when it comes to actually voting in the general election, they still say, well, we're going to vote Labour, who haven't come up with any... They say, oh, yes, we've got plans to deal with it, but we don't know what on earth they are.
Sure, but the Conservatives have been in power for 13 and a half years and have done nothing to fix the problem. Net migration is higher than ever. They were talking for years and years about getting migration down to the tens of thousands. What was it the other week? 700,000, something in that region? I mean, the problem for the government now is that saying, well, what about Labour's policy and is Keir Starmer fit for purpose? Nobody's interested in that because it's the Conservative record people are looking at, which is dire.
So this really is a case of a government losing an election rather than an opposition party winning it?
I think so. And I think, really, the question now is the scale of the majority. Is it going to be that kind of 97 landslide, where there was a very clear wave of enthusiasm for Tony Blair? Possibly not, but
no,
I think it really...
I mean, he isn't a Tony Blair, is he?
No.
Starmer.
No, I don't think he is. I don't think he has that sort of, that popular appeal. I don't think people quite understand what the programme's going to be. However, as you say, Stephen, I think this is really a case of people being fed up with the government who've been in power for a long time.
And fed up, well, we're all sort of fighting a cost of living crisis. And that's certainly paramount, I would have thought, in people's minds when they're voting in the next few months. To see the money wasted at the moment on Rwanda. 290
million on this policy to get from point A to point A.
Yeah.
Right, just to get it in front of the
they're a couple of steps back from point A.
Probably.
And all that money has been spent.
Well, look, I can understand why you've got to spend money up front, because you've got to get some... But it's... Why was nobody saying this is going to be a really big problem getting it through, you know, the legislative process here, but getting it through the courts? Why was no one doing that level of forward thinking, forward planning?
It's remarkable, and seemingly Rishi Sunak was never a huge fan of this plan anyway. But I think he's in a cul-de-sac, he's so stuck that he feels he has to kind of double down on this unworkable policy that even he doesn't truly deep down believe in. I mean, by the way, if this policy does, let's say the bill does go through, it's incredibly expensive even then to implement. So it's a...
Well, and you've already got lawyers pointing out that it's insufficiently watertight, which means they know how to poke holes in it.
Yeah, and the government's own legal advice says there's only a 50% chance of demonstrating that it is legal.
I just wonder if you think it's exciting, this idea of Bojo and Nigel Farage leading... being a dream ticket for the next election. Would it be, in your mind, a dream ticket?
It would... you know... I can't see it happening. I really can't see it happening, because, look, whether you agree with Nigel or not, he's a man of principle. And I think it would be seen as too much of a cop-out. I think he'd see it as too much of a cop-out.
But to be offered the chance of a ministerial job in the next Conservative government, he would be very tempted at that, wouldn't he?
He'd be tempted.
It's probably his only real successcul bid for a real job.
But would it be a sellout just to say, well, I'm going to be a government minister? Rather than... Because he'd have to come... As we saw with...
Immigration
from 2010 and all that, and the coalition, that's the word I'm looking for. Obviously, the Lib Dems had to really compromise on that. Of course they did.
More than their own electorate wanted them to.
Yeah, and Nigel would have to come, and Richard Tice would have to really compromise. Would you, if you're a Reform supporter, would you be happy with them doing that? That's one to get in touch with this morning.
That's an interesting one, because if you are a Reform supporter, that's not why you're supporting Reform, just for them to do a deal with the Tories.